This session is brought to you by Thomas Tachek, Alex Badushi, Sean Delvlin, Steve Thomas from Matasano.
My people. Thank you. Except like move the mics around. Or just project.
Thanks for coming, guys. I guess let's just get started here. We're going to go over a quick problem here, and here I'm going to describe RSA really quick if you don't know it. Each party in RSA has a public key and a private key. Public key is, these are all integers, is a modulus n and a public exponent e. Private keys are that same modulus n and a private integer d. So it's super simple for encryption and decryption. When we do encryption, it's just the plain text to that public e value, mod n. And for decryption, we do the ciphertext to the d, secret d value, mod n. Now, we get to choose what e we use. And since this is exponentiation, we'd like to choose something smaller, so it's quicker, a little bit more optimized. But there's issues with choosing small e's. For instance, like e equals 3, we open ourselves up to broadcast attacks, cube root attacks. Now, let's take a look at SaltStack. If you don't know SaltStack, it's like a replacement for Puppet or Ansible. And we're just trying to run commands on our remote servers. And instead of using SSH, they use RSA. Can anybody see what the issue with their RSA implementation is?
Like
okay.
Like a show of hands if you get the problem here. So SaltStack chose the most efficient of the RSA public exponents, which would be one. The most priceless thing about this GitHub issue report is the comment from the team there, where don't worry, people. We didn't use the public key is not one, just the public exponent is one. And you can see from the formula for actually how you do RSA. RSA, you raise the message to the eth power, and if e is 1, then RSA is quite fast and quite useful.
I would argue that an exponent of 0 is actually more efficient than an exponent of 1.
So I guess like the motivation for this talk is just the degree to which nobody who implements cryptography gets it right. There's a zillion vulnerabilities out there. And like, if you ever get time and you can remember from all these talks you're gonna see, this one piece of advice, go to the thread on GitHub, I wish I had a link for it, where they show that problem and they have people explaining it. There's all sorts of crazy crypto nonsense on that thread that people believe. So some of what we wanna do today is just to demystify some of this stuff. So I guess, there's going to be a lot of detail in this talk. We're going to talk pretty fast. We did a dry run of this talk beforehand. It took us about 50 minutes. So I'm going to talk about this fast for the rest of the talk. So, you're not going to walk out of this talk knowing how to exploit RSA padding oracles. I can't do that with a slide deck, right? But I can show you how straightforward the attacks are and give you the motivation to go figure this stuff out for yourself. And we'll talk later on about how we're going to make it even easier for you to do that. So the takeaway for this, kind of just let the math wash over you like a poetry of insecurity and all that, and just kind of trust us that one of the points of this talk is just this stuff is simpler than you think it is. So I guess before we start, we're going to go through a lot of different crypto attacks in this talk, and we're going to talk about the crypto challenges. So there's some just some details, some background about cryptography fields, groups, the difference between a group and a ring, the difference between a PRP and a PRF, Feistel structure, linear algebra. So a little bit of that. We want to get the stuff that you need to know about that out of the way first. So let's just take that off the table right now. This is a problem when people try to learn cryptography. If you go to a source trying to learn cryptography, the very first things they start you out with is like, what's a Feistel network and things like that. We've gone through almost all of the attacks that we know how to exploit at Matasano in this talk, and none of them require any of this theory. In fact, if you want to learn this theory, the right way to learn it is to code the attacks first so that stuff will make sense to you. So the backstory here is, we got pretty good at finding crypto vulnerabilities in software. And like I said earlier, like if you're not looking for crypto vulnerabilities on projects, you're missing some amazing bugs. So I wanted the rest of my team to know how to find these bugs. So I write this text file with a bunch of crypto exercises in it, right? And we wind up with this pretty interesting set of crypto vulnerabilities. And we're thinking, you know, this would make a pretty great blog post, right? We should find a way to share this and kind of stake a claim on this crypto stuff. I have a slight problem with posting the entire text file to the internet. And that is that I have a mental illness, which leads me to be, you know, completely addicted to winning message board arguments and arguments on Twitter. And the problem I basically have is there are people who shall remain nameless that I will end up arguing with on Twitter, and I don't want to arm them with the jargon that would allow me not to trump them in arguments by busting out my own jargon, right? Like, I don't want them to know what a CTR nonce collision is. I don't want them to have those words, right? If they're going to have those words, I want them to know what it means. So we have a solution. The solution we came up with just out of necessity to keep these terrible secrets out of the hands of people who might win arguments with me online is we carved the challenges up into sets of 8. And what we did was, if you emailed us and asked us for a set of 8, we would give you the first set of crypto challenges. And in order to get the next set of crypto challenges, you would have to send us back the code that you use to exploit those challenges. So we carved it up into sets. We tuned the sets up a little bit. We embedded a lot of Kid and Play and Wu-Tang lyrics into the sets just to spice things up. And yeah, so the net result here is the only way you get crypto terminology, and by the way, it was pretty amazing that almost nobody leaked anything. We did this with a lot of people, almost nobody. The honor system for this worked brilliantly, right? So in order to get the jargon, you have to know how to code. So what happens is there's this guy, if you're not familiar with Pinboard or with the Idlewords blog, I think he might be the best writer on the internet. Well, he's also a really excellent programmer, and he wrote a little blog post about doing the crypto challenges. And that blog post, this is not the best screenshot, but this blog post was for a long time on the top of Hacker News. A lot of people saw it, and a lot of people ended up doing the crypto challenges, way more than we expected. Before this blog post happened, we were doing everything manually. People would send us the sets, and we'd be in Apple Mail and dragging things around and doing manual replies. And then suddenly, like, you know, more than 10,000 people are doing them. So huge numbers of people are doing the challenges.
And so these people who did the challenges submitted them in a variety of languages. And so you see at the top there, this is basically a breakdown of the kinds of languages that people submitted solutions in. So Python, obviously dominant there with like 40% of the market. Then you have, going down the chart, Golang and Ruby coming in at second and third. Kind of like a few other traditional kind of imperative, you know, object-oriented procedural kind of languages.
A lot of people like picked up languages to do the crypto challenges with. That's what Mache told people to do, is if you want to learn a new language, this is a great way to do it, is to pick up the crypto challenges and try to learn it. So it's like a running joke how many people started with.
So, you know, your Haskells, your Closures, your Scalas, like the more exotic languages on here, you know, we see a few of these things. A lot of those people didn't finish. I'm guessing probably because they just weren't that familiar with the environment. And we saw some even more exotic stuff. So I guess you can flip.
Yeah, a little hard to read this, but lots and lots and lots of different languages
Right.
here.
There's a long tail of languages, basically.
And we got solutions, we got complete set 6 solutions for all these languages. Everything on here, at least one person finished. So it was pretty impressive. Like, we have a Rosetta Code for all these different languages, which we're publishing.
One of the more exotic ones is, so, you know, Microsoft Excel. Someone submitted some solutions in Microsoft Excel. And so this is like an implementation of the AES block cipher in Excel. And when we say Excel, we don't mean like VB script. We mean like table, like cell references. So like someone wrote all the like AES S boxes out into Excel and then wrote these references.
This is amazing. This is the coolest thing.
So this is this is the same guy, by the way. But this is a PostScript file that kind of illustrates AES, but all the images you see are also generated by an implementation of AES written in PostScript embedded in the file. And then, you know, obviously the most exotic, you know, kind of out there language for cryptography is JavaScript.
So CryptoCat is a JavaScript app that they try to do usable encryption, and also there's cats.
The cats are very important to the security of CryptoCat. So CryptoCat, it's like a messaging application. It's the supposedly the heir apparent to PGP. It's the standard bearer for usable cryptography. And for the thing we want to illustrate here, we want to talk about a little bit here. So CryptoCat uses elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman in order to get the two parties that are chatting with each other, or the however many parties are chatting with each other, to share keys. And we want to talk a little bit about how they got that wrong. So
during this time frame, you could actually break the public keys and decrypt the chat.
And we're going to talk a little bit about how that worked, right? So an interesting thing to look at here is just look at the time period here from May 7th, 2012 to June 3rd, 2013. Now, a lot of things were happening. I'm sure Beyonce had a new album in that period of time. Lots of things were happening with politics and Congress and all that. And one other thing was happening at the same time. While this was happening, that's an ECB encrypted Edward Snowden, if you can see it properly. I don't know how the resolution works, but you know, the whole Snowden thing was happening. So you're wondering, why does it matter? Certainly Snowden is not relying on cats for the security of his communications with Glenn Greenwald. That couldn't possibly be happening.
But it did actually happen. The time frame isn't exactly known, but anything early June or earlier would have been easily broken.
I'm still kind of head exploding about how Glenn Greenwald was unable to get OTR working. OTR was not usable enough, so they switched to CryptoCat for extra usability. But the timeframes here match up pretty nicely. So assuming that, and the June 3rd is the period where the fix went in,
yeah. But
then there's a lag after the fix goes in, after the fix for the Firefox module for CryptoCat goes in, before Firefox or before Mozilla approves it, right? I don't know how long it is. It's
well, for Firefox, it's 2 weeks.
It's 2 weeks. So 2 weeks after June 3rd is when that fix would have been applied. So I guess long story short, if NSA was, say, collecting all of CryptoCat's chats, which I'm sure they weren't doing, I'm sure there's way too many CryptoCat chats for them to have been collecting them, they can go back and decrypt all of those chats. And, some things went wrong there. I think, so this is the old Diffie-Hellman stuff. We might want to go fast through this, but
basically what this was before they switched to elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. They kept on changing the size of the private key. So that's 10 to the 64. Then they reduced it to 10 to the 32. That's actually breakable. Basically,
10 to the 32 is breakable.
Yeah. Because with tax level, we'll talk later about you can get that down to 10 to the 16. So.
And then we've got 32 to the 26th. I guess apparently, and you know the backstory on this better than I do, but there's commit messages that go with this where they're saying these are performance improvements, right? We're shaving bytes off of the performance, the key here, we're getting it faster and faster while dragging Diffie-Hellman performance down. It goes from 26 to 24. You got the last 2 bytes down.
So to clarify, when you say it's breakable, what kind of investment would you have to make to break that?
Well, for this, it'd be, actually I don't know this one specifically, but it's like a few thousand to, more. And
this is the especially fun bug.
This one, basically they mistaked strings for the big int library. Basically, instead of using 15-bit integers, they were using decimal. So basically it ended up being 2 times 10 to the 16 was the key space, square rooted. So this is key strength over time.
The line goes up when, that's June, when they finally applied your fixes to it?
When it gets to the very top.
The very top. So there's a step there's a step early on there where they got it a little bit stronger. So the punchline to this story is, I guess it's to CryptoCat, which we should talk a little bit about. But there's a period of time in here, this long red line there is a period of time where you can take a DigitalOcean droplet and take collected messages from CryptoCat and break the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman theories in there because they got strings and integers confused among other problems in CryptoCat, right? And there's a little jump there where an early fix got in there. This is important because it's important to the CryptoCat team to say that nothing really serious was on the CryptoCat network during that time. But that first bump there, that takes it out of the realm of breaking a DigitalOcean droplet.
Yeah, basically it's $20 million, roughly,
So,
to generate a table, to break it. Well, it takes about a month to generate, roughly, then about a week per key. So the attack that you would use is baby step, giant step. Basically, this is just pseudocode for it. You basically set half the bits to 0, like the trailing bits to 0 for 1, and you generate all those keys, store them to disk. Then when you want to break a key, the other bits that you weren't using before, you basically take the public key, then subtract it by those, and then look it up in the table. Then basically it square roots the.
So like the pseudocode you're looking at here, the real point is not that you totally understand how baby step, giant step is a classical algorithm for breaking Diffie-Hellman, or for solving the discrete log problem, which is what underpins Diffie-Hellman. The important thing is not that you understand exactly how this code works. The important thing is that you see how short it is, right? It's very, very simple, very classical number theory code to break this. We could have set up a crypto challenge easily for implementing baby step, giant step. It was actually important to one of the things that comes later that we're doing in a later set for the crypto challenges, right? So the important thing here is that the code is really simple now. One of the reasons we're stumbling a little bit at this point is that I gave him just last night to set the demo up for this, and the demo involves him building some giant Bloom filter to accelerate baby step, giant step, and
Well, it's basically you got like 300 gigs of SSD, and I wanted to set up a Bloom filter K = 8, so that I would only have to disk like 1 in 256.
there was a sweet demo here, and I sabotaged it.
I made a mistake, so basically the Bloom filter didn't work. So instead of being under a second, it would have been like 256 seconds because of all the disk access.
Decryptocat is the most well-known thing that happened to CryptoCat. It involves very simple, very basic cryptography code and a decent-sized virtual machine on DigitalOcean. And from that, it takes, what, minutes to break individual CryptoCat messages? Seconds. I'm sorry, I'm insulting your code, right? It takes seconds to break CryptoCat messages because of vulnerabilities in CryptoCat, but that is not the only thing that is wrong with CryptoCat. And, kind of tying into what we're doing with the challenges here, you can go through CryptoCat, which is a fairly important piece of cryptocode that lots of people use, and look at and find a number of different vulnerabilities. That first vulnerability, the AES-CTR with colliding nonces, makes the messages even easier to break.
Yeah, they set the IV to 0.
Right, so, we looked at some of the old DH code a couple days ago, and there's a bunch of RSA problems in it. Like, you can just take a tour of that code and find a bunch of cool challenges to implement. And so, we want to talk a little bit about kind of what those vulnerabilities are and how they tie into the crypto challenges. Alex, this is, I think.
Yeah, so set 1 here was just really setting the stage for the crypto challenges. And here we've got some basic functions, XORing, repeating key XOR, that you're going to be using later in the challenges. This was basically just used to prove that, 1, you can code, so you can hopefully then get the rest of it, get the jargon, and then move on to set 2. That one, embarrassingly enough for me, was the hardest. That repeating key XOR took me about 2 weeks to do. Actually, how many people have actually done the challenges or started them?
It's good news for us because it's news to a lot of you, but yeah, so there's only one tricky attack on that first set, which is an academic kind of crypto 101. You're using a repeating keyed XOR thing, which turns out to be valuable in a later set too. So
set 2, we move into like a little bit more of the meat here. We introduced block cipher modes, some good attacks here, but we really get into some good stuff in set 3.
So set 2 also has a bunch of ECB mode attacks. This is the first set where if you've implemented these, you're already way better on pen tests. Just 2 sets in, and you are finding remote code execution vulnerabilities in real-world applications based on block cipher modes.
So this is more block cipher modes with the famous CBC padding oracle here. And we also move into some merging twister, RNG state attacks here as well.
So this is stream ciphers, this is breaking randomness. The merge and twister is the random number generator that RAND gives you in Python, PHP, and Ruby. So breaking those random number generators, breaking stream ciphers derived from them, things like that. So You can see in the bottom we're also noting how many people finished. So like roughly 1,000 people finished that first set, and like maybe 500 finished the second set, and we're gradually tapering off as we go forward here.
Set 4, we do more CTR mode stuff, introduce hash functions, length extension attacks, starting in the HMAX here.
We talked more about CTR, but we did a Black Hat talk a couple of years ago where we talked about how to exploit CTR and colliding nonsense. But just so you know, CTR is how you turn AES from a block cipher into a stream cipher. It's the most important block cipher mode in block cryptography, right? And there are things that go terribly wrong that allow you to break it. And then the length extension thing is really important here too.
So then set 5, we finally introduced like public key cryptography. We do Diffie-Hellman, SRP, and then some cool RSA attacks down there.
That's not a very cool RSA attack. It's a pretty weak RSA attack.
Okay, and so in set 6, the continuation of public key stuff, we have some DSA, and then finally culminating in the RSA padding oracle. This is Daniel Blankenbacher's 1998 attack on SSL. So this is a pretty cool attack, and still mostly under the radar, but it's something you can actually find in application level cryptography. So basically, for people who aren't familiar with a padding oracle, this is basically like a plain text recovery attack. So the attacker has like a piece of ciphertext, and they can talk to the server that decrypts. And if they can detect errors in decryption, they can kind of piece together enough information to recover the original plain text.
So if you want to see how this comes up in like the real world, where you'd see this in an actual pen test, imagine you have like a payment processing application, right? And imagine that payment processing company has clients that have their own web apps, right? And they want their clients to be able to RSA encrypt credit card numbers so that those clients won't be PCI encumbered. They can do the RSA on their side and then send the RSA encrypted messages to the payment processor. And then you want to imagine our attacker capturing those RSA encrypted credit card numbers. And the thing to kind of get in your head here is that a credit card number is really small, right? So a credit card number fits, usually when you encrypt with RSA, you do a combination of RSA and an actual block cipher. But people, they see things like small fixed size numbers like credit card numbers fit nicely into RSA moduli, and so they think they're just going to encrypt that directly. And so you'll find that in a lot of places where people do RSA that way, that they have this vulnerability.
So just to go into a little bit of detail on the way RSA padding is used. So RSA padding is actually necessary for security. So when we do padding in other modes of encryption, so in particular in symmetric encryption, people often try to avoid having to do padding at all. So for stream ciphers, you don't require any padding. But for RSA, it's actually necessary. RSA encrypting just a raw message is trivially broken. So we can't even go into it here, but
we have an exercise in set 6 that breaks unpadded RSA messages, which is also great to know because RSA is really simple, like we showed in the first couple slides there, right? It's just take a number, raise it to the nth power, and then it's encrypted, right? So it's deceptive because people, JavaScript programmers, for instance, will get a big num library and implement just the math for RSA, and then it's they're gonna play with it a little bit, see that it works and encrypts things, and then stop there. It's I now have enough technology to encrypt messages with RSA. You will find unpadded RSA implementations in the real world. Now, the vulnerability that we're going to describe here is more complicated. We're breaking padded RSA. My friend Nate Lawson, from whom we got 3/4 of these challenges come from Nate Lawson, right? He's our mentor for cryptography, right? My friend Nate Lawson likes to say that we shouldn't call RSA padding padding. And in block cipher crypto, we're trying to get rid of padding as much as possible. Cryptographers prefer CTR mode to CBC mode because CBC mode has padding and CTR mode doesn't, right? You want to avoid padding with block cipher crypto. Well, in RSA, it's not like that. We should call RSA padding armoring instead of padding, because without the armoring on RSA, RSA has no security whatsoever. But this, what we're showing you right here, this is padded RSA. It is the default, de facto standard padding used for almost every RSA implementation you'll see. It's not the best padding. Everyone knows it's not the best padding, but if you see a fresh RSA implementation, this is the padding that they're probably using, and you should probably explain it now instead of talking over you.
So the way this padding actually works is basically, the idea is to fill the entire size of the modulus, the public key modulus. And so what we do for this is we start with a leading byte, and it's just the byte 2. And then we have a random padding string, and then we have a null delimiter and followed by the actual message. And And so what we're actually going to exploit here is the fact that that leading byte is fixed at 2. That tells us actually a lot of information about just the bounds of the message that we're encrypting. And it turns out that that's going to be exploitable.
So remember, the vulnerability that we're talking about here is we're exploiting a padding oracle. And I don't know, show of hands real quick, how many people have heard of the CBC padding oracle before? It's a pretty popular crypto attack, but great. So the idea behind the padding oracle, again, is you have an application that's receiving messages that are receiving ciphertext from what they hope is a valid person talking to it. And the very first thing they do after they decrypt the messages, they check the padding. You have to check the padding to see if it's a valid message. And a padding oracle is what happens when the target behaves differently based on whether the padding is valid or not. And you can see why it might behave differently. Like in OpenSSL, for instance, if you try to decrypt a message and it has invalid padding, you're going to get an exception. So in the Ruby bindings, the Python bindings for OpenSSL, if you have a message with bad padding, it raises an exception. You can imagine in a web application, for instance, you're going to see the exception. You'll get a 500 error, or at least a different error, based on whether the padding is valid or not. And what we're going to do is we're going to exploit just that one signal. Just the fact that the padding was valid or not valid, which you can imagine is very easy for an application to accidentally reveal to us, right? And from just knowing whether the padding is valid or not, in this case, with RSA padding, knowing that the message starts properly with 2 is going to tell us enough to decrypt the entire message. Again, this is the de facto standard padding for almost every piece of software fielded with RSA encryption. So I don't know if you went to the end of the slides before I stepped on you there, but.
I guess the only other thing to mention is that obviously, the messages are going to be between 20000 extending and 2FFFFF. So we can call those lower and upper bounds 2B and 3B, basically, for the purposes of these slides.
Yeah, every RSA message, every RSA ciphertext is a scalar integer. It's a single number. This is true of RSA, and I think people think it's true of everything, but it's not true of AES and other crypto. But in RSA crypto, every message is simply a number. And so for a message to have valid padding, that message has to start with 2. So the message has to be between 2B and 3B, 20000 and 2FFFFFF, right? So that sounds bad, but 2FFFFF is a gigantic number, right? So the fact that we've constrained it there shouldn't affect the security that much at all, but it does here because it bounds the size of the message. So almost none of you know what this is, but this is a little iOS algebra application that I have my kids do, right? So if you can make the frog talk to the lizard and drag the lizard across the line or whatever, you're learning algebra while you do that. So people in the audience, if you can pass a 9th grade algebra test, or if you can make the frog talk to the lizard, drag them across the line, this app is called Dragonbox. You can go download it. Do this before you learn Blankenbacher, this attack that we're talking about. Go do the little algebra application, because that's all the math you're going to need for this attack, right? So we said, you have one more thing to say.
Okay, so
this is cool, by the way. This property of RSA is really neat.
So the way we're actually going to exploit this is that there's a property of RSA that we can we can multiply ciphertext together and get the same result as if we had multiplied the plaintext together before encryption. So you can see we have this plaintext 355 set up, and we encrypt that and we get 609. Likewise, we encrypt the plaintext 2. So suppose we want to double the original plaintext message, and we get 8 back. Obviously, 2 to the 3rd power is 8.
So if you follow this, you can multiply ciphertext in RSA. RSA is homomorphic with respect to multiplication. You ever heard of homomorphic encryption? That's the idea that you can do operations on ciphertext and have them actually work, right? Well, in RSA, you can multiply ciphertext together. I can multiply the encryption of 2 and the encryption of 4 and get back 2 times 4 as plaintext. That's just a property of the math behind RSA, and we're going to exploit it here.
Right, so you can see basically the attack we want to carry out is we have the ciphertext C, which is...
That's our captured RSA encrypted credit card number.
This is something we've observed on the wire or in some other circumstance. And we know that P has valid padding. So what we want to try to do here is we want to find some integer S such that we can multiply P by S and get back another integer with valid padding. And that's going to leak a little bit of information about P. And we can use that, basically to eventually reconstruct P entirely.
So we have the captured message C, and we have our corrupting influence S. S is this number that we're multiplying into the ciphertext. We're going to start with a very small s. We're going to start with 2 or 3 or 4. And we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep multiplying s into the ciphertext, and we're going to send that corrupted message to the server, and we're going to see if we get valid padding back or not. And so that's the oracle. The oracle is us saying, well, if you multiply this number into this ciphertext and you get back a valid padding, then you know that that message had valid padding, and that's the oracle here. So here's the math, and again, like I said, let this wash over you like a calm wave of mathiness. So the first line here that you're seeing, that is just a simple expression of modular arithmetic. Almost everybody in the audience, if you sat down and coded this, kind of would have an easy, intuitive sense of how modular multiplication works. This is clock math, right? You multiply x and y together, you take it mod n, it's the remainder after you divide out n, right? So on the top line there, the left-hand side is the normal way that we express modular arithmetic. If you wrote out the equation, that's what you'd say. But to understand this attack or to kind of follow it, you have to write it a different way. So the right-hand side of that equation is the same thing. We're expressing the exact same mathematical operation. So what we're doing here is we're taking the simple product, the very large number, right? That number is going to be way bigger than the modulus, right? And so instead of taking the remainder, dividing and taking the remainder, what we're going to do is we're going to count how many times we wrap the modulus, that's the number r. We're just going to subtract that off this. So the important thing to understand here is just that the left-hand side of that and the right-hand side of that is the same equation, the same thing, just two different ways of expressing it. On the bottom, you'll note that both of those equations are the same equation, right? All I did was I flipped the left-hand side and the right-hand side. If you graduated 8th grade, please tell me you understand that, right? So x, let x be the corrupted ciphertext that we have back now. When we refer to x, we're saying we started s at 2, at 3, at 4, at 5. We sent these messages in. Eventually, we got one that had valid padding. That's x. When we talk about x, that is a corrupted message with valid padding. Now, we know just from the way RSA works that for us to have gotten that message, x must be the original plaintext times s, our corrupting influence, 2, 3, 4, 5, eventually valid padding, minus rn. Again, just from the definition of modular arithmetic, that's how you express that. So the corrupted message works out to this expression of the plaintext, which we don't know, times s, which we do know, minus rn. We know what n is, but we don't know what r is. R is the number of times we've wrapped the modulus. Now, basic algebra. We can take those expressions and solve them for different unknowns. We don't know the plaintext, we don't know the number of times that we've wrapped the modulus. So what we're going to do is basic algebra. We're going to get p by itself on the left-hand side of the equation. And if you do that, it works out that p is going to be x plus rn over s. Again, x, our corrupted message, r, the number of times we wrap the modulus, and the modulus over s, the number that we know that we multiplied into the message to get the valid plaintext. Now, it looks like we've solved RSA here at this point because we have p by itself on the left-hand side, but we obviously haven't because we don't know what r is. There are unknowns on the right-hand side of the equation. We can do the same thing for r, exact same set of steps. We're solving for now the number of times we've wrapped the modulus. Now we get an expression just like that p expression before, basic algebra, p works out to that, r works out to this. P times s, the plaintext times s, minus the corrupted message over n. Now, there's no, like, if you just look at it, and it took me a while, right? If you just look at it, there's no intuitive reason why r works out to p times s minus x over n. I'm not smart enough to see that instantly, but if you do the algebra, it just does, right? Just do the steps, get r by itself on the left-hand side, and it works out to this. Right? So here's the cool thing that Blankenbacher does, right? We don't know what r is, we don't know exactly what p is, but we know something about those numbers. We know they have valid padding. So what we're going to do is, for the unknowns, we're going to substitute in the bounds. We know the message has to be between 2, 0, 0, 0, 0, and 2, f, 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 f. We're going to put the intervals and plug them into the equation. We do that for p, we do that for r, we do that for s.
Right, and so basically what this is going to give us is like a boundary for r. So we'll have like a range of r values that are possible. And while it took us a long time to find the first successful s value that would give us a validly padded x message, we can now find many more values for s that are successful pretty quickly. So before it would be on the order of like 10,000 or 100,000 attempts before we find a successful S. But now it's going to be maybe like 10 attempts. And each successful S we find is going to help us narrow the bounds on our message by a great margin. It's essentially going to allow us to cut it in half each time. And
to get some perspective of this, I'm sorry for stepping on you, but I love making this point, right? So you're thinking RSA 2048, you have numbers that are so large, you can imagine brute forcing RSA, right? But we're dealing with numbers that are so large that to count forward through all that number space, to go from 0 to 2048 and just count that space, right? We're talking heat death of the universe amounts of time to brute force all those individual numbers, the whole 2K space, the 2 kilobit space of numbers that we're working in here. So what this is allowing us to do here as we do this is we find these intervals and plug them in and find new x values and s values and all that. What it's doing is instead of us counting slowly forward from the beginning of the message space all the way to the end of the message space, what it's doing is it's allowing us to jump forward in that space, to rule out large swaths of the space of the numbers there. It's essentially letting us travel forward in time. So instead of having to wait for 10 million years to get through the whole space, it's going to let us jump several million years. I should have worked out what the cost of those, like how much you're saving every time you do it. But every time you compute these intervals, and you do this over and over again and iterate the algorithm, every time you do it, it's drastically cutting through the whole space of the RSA modulus. So
what it does basically is it turns like a linear search into a logarithmic one. So it basically makes this attack feasible and actually really cheap. So we have a short demo here that we're going to show. So what you're seeing here in action is the results of repeated successful S queries. So if you follow the red byte as it goes along, that's kind of like values locking in like byte by byte. So you can see we're recovering the high order bytes first. You can see the 0002. That's that leading 2 byte we were talking about. And that green 0, that is the null delimiter kind of highlighting the end of the padding string and the beginning of the actual plain text message, which you can see we're recovering now. And you can see that this is basically going along at like a linear pace. Like it's not taking us a longer time to recover the lower order bytes. Like we're moving along through it, and this is going very quickly. So this is with like a 1024-bit key. So this is like a very feasible attack to bring off in like an application level setting.
For a while, you know, this attack used to be called the million message attack, and it was called the million message attack so as to make it sound less feasible. It was found originally in TLS. This vulnerability exists in TLS. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the Java implementation of TLS was found to have this vulnerability. It didn't spit out, like the reason people didn't find it until recently was it didn't spit out an error about valid padding. But the behavior of the target changed based on whether the padding was valid or not. I can't remember which Java TLS implementation it was, but it was a really cool vulnerability report where they got the Blankenbacher attack to work against TLS with a modern TLS library, just based on behavior differences, if the padding was valid or the padding wasn't valid. So like million message attack is supposed to tell you that there's a hard attack to carry off, but we've done it in web pen test settings. So every time as you watch those red bytes go by and it was locking in on the red bytes, those are network queries, right? It's going to take some time to go through it, but at the end of it, you've decrypted the message. What you've done is you've tricked the server into taking these cipher texts and revealing the plain text of the message for you. From that. So, 9th grade algebra, study it.
So we originally had 6 sets. We released a 7th set about a year ago. It was a little bit more esoteric, but it had a little bit of interesting stuff in there. So we had some CBC Mac stuff. You see that if you're doing embedded work. We had some compression side channels, which if you're familiar with the crime attack on TLS from a few years ago, that's what that's about. A little bit of stuff about the RC4 single byte biases.
So all these are going to be public, hopefully by the end of today, but no later than tomorrow, with solutions in every language that we can get releases for. We've got about 10 of them right now. So it'll be cryptopals.com. I should have put the URL on the screen, but cryptopals.com. Every one of these exercises spelled out. So all I got to be able to do is code. Go do the exercises. They're pretty great. Great way to learn crypto. So we're going to go a little bit faster. So the next attack we want to show you is pretty badass. So that's set 7, and then set 8. So set 8 is the last set we think we're going to do. So we did some number theory earlier in set 5 and set 6. We have really good coverage of block cipher cryptography in set 3 and 4 and 2. Set 8 all ECC. So we're not going to break down all of set. We haven't released set 8 yet to anybody. No one's seen it yet. But we're going to tease it with one very cool, very practical attack against elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. So. Diffie-Hellman, I'm not going to take too much time explaining Diffie-Hellman, but it's just a way, it's the simplest number theoretic crypto algorithm. It's the simplest public key crypto algorithm. You can go to Wikipedia right now and get examples of Diffie-Hellman and then go into Python or the IRB and Ruby or whatever. Very much worth doing this. Just go to Wikipedia and do an example of Diffie-Hellman, just do it. So basically the idea is you start with a large prime number, a G, which is a small number that both sides agree on, right? And then both sides generate lowercase a, lowercase b, those are private keys, right? And so to go from your private key and generate a public key, you raise G to the 8th power. You raise G to the secret key's power, you get cap A. Other side gets cap B. You exchange cap A and cap B. So, Alice has lowercase a and uppercase b, and Bob has lowercase b and uppercase a, right? And they can both raise those numbers to the other power, right? And magically, they're going to agree on the same number. This underpins all of TLS forward secrecy, for instance. This is how TLS generates new keys on the fly so the NSA can't capture traffic, break keys, go back in time and decrypt other messages. How do you generate ephemeral keys? So Diffie-Hellman. We're going to talk about elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, just so you get a sense of, we got submissions in all the different languages. This is what a C# submission implementing Diffie-Hellman looks like. Very small is my point here. Very simple algorithm. This is Golang. Golang only looks long because the guy put the whole constant that we asked him to put in there. Also pretty small, not much longer than C#. Golang, great language, do it. It's Haskell, just Haskell's very advanced language. We like it a lot. And there's Ruby. So, don't cheat and read the solutions, but we'll make them available to you guys hopefully tomorrow, right? But that's Diffie-Hellman in a couple different languages. Really, that is all of Diffie-Hellman. This is not artificial. This is all the code that it would take to implement Diffie-Hellman. A little bit trickier to implement elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. And if you're going to implement Diffie-Hellman in 2014, you're going to use elliptic curve to do it. And we're going to show you how to break popular implementations of elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. We're going to do a point-off curve attack on elliptic curve. This is a two-step attack. The first part of the attack is similar to Blankenbacher in that we are tricking the server into revealing fragments of the keys. And Steve and Alex are going to explain how that works. And then Sean and Alex are going to explain how you take those key fragments and put them back together.
So first to describe elliptic curve, the cyclical group for it, we need to learn I need to talk about how a clock works. So basically what we're going to focus on is just adding. So 4 plus 10 modulo 13 would be 1.
You can tell time. I think you're probably good with that.
So consider that there's a magical hash function that masks what that number actually is, but clock math still actually works. So hash of 4 plus hash of 10 would still be hash of 1.
Sorry, I'm thirsty.
So with elliptic curve, there's 3 parameters. There's the curve itself, the p point, that's the generator, and the modulo prime.
We're showing you this, by the way, so if you understand Diffie-Hellman, if you've implemented Diffie-Hellman ever, ECC is just a different mathematical domain that we do Diffie-Hellman in, right? You need a couple of basic operations to operate on elliptic curves, and then you take Diffie-Hellman as is, and you do it in the elliptic curve domain, and it suddenly becomes much stronger, much faster. And so these are the parameters that you need, the base point, the shape of the curve and all that, to do elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman.
So basically, that magical hash function is basically like scalar point multiplication. So the way multiplication works on elliptic curves is you add 2 points, and you can only add 2 points or double a point. So same thing, 4 times p plus 10 times p would be 1 times p.
So, yeah, we should actually fly through this.
Yeah.
So, and then we don't need this slide anymore. So, Alex, your attack.
Yeah. So here we're attacking elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, like we said. And there's a few things that enable us to do this attack. First is you see the curve shape up there. That's the equation for the curve. The only 2 bits of information that distinguish 2 different curves are that A and B parameter. And one thing that enables this attack is the fact that some implementations of that addition or point doubling do not take into account that B parameter. So you see here I have 2 curves, one B equals 7, the larger curve, and one B equals 8. So if I gave you a point on the B equals 7 curve and I told you to double it, you would give me back a point on that curve if we're not taking into account the curve shape there.
So you imagine that the outer curve there is a secure curve. It's a curve that we've chosen carefully, or NIST chose it for us or whatever. That equation is a curve in the short Weierstrass form. It's the basis for instance, the NIST curves, for instance. So just understand that outer curve, 2 curves, each alike in shape, but they have different B parameters. And the one with B equals 7 here is a secure curve. It's one we've chosen carefully. The one that on the inside is an insecure curve. It's one that Alex has chosen carefully. And the trick here is that we can get a victim to compute on the wrong curve.
So the thing there, can you go back?
Sure.
So if you consider that function as like a function of x to determine y, then you use the input x and the fixed a and b to determine a y. But if you have a receiver who's willing to take an x and a y and do computations on them, then the b becomes sort of unimportant. and you can use the x and y to determine the b.
So you can imagine, like, if by that equation, if you have, x equals 1, maybe y should equal 10, right? So now you have a protocol where they're sending both coordinates on the curve, right? So x equals 1, y should equal 10, right? We already know that it should equal 10 because the formula tells us it should, right? But instead of saying y equals 10, we say y equals 10,000. Right? That is a point off in outer space. It is nowhere near the curve. It's not a point on the curve, right? And it also doesn't help us that much to say y is 10,000, right? But if we're careful about what we say y is, we don't say y is 10,000, we don't put the point off in outer space, we target it really specifically to land on a different curve, right? So instead of being outer space, instead of y is 10,000, maybe y is 4 or something like that, right? And that point puts it on the insecure curve that we want the target to operate on.
So what we get from that is, like, we'll take a step back. In the honest setting, if I'm communicating with Alice here, I'm going to be sending a point that is on the original curve, and that point corresponds with a generator of the curve. The generator of the curve is just a point that encompasses every single possible point on the curve. Now, by sending a point from a bad curve, I'm pinpointing you, I'm forcing you to do the operation on my curve, and then your operation with your secret key can only take a few different values. And that's where the leak of your secret key comes into play. So if you're able to do this multiple times, you get multiple pieces of the secret key mod some number g, which was, in this case, would be like the order of...
So we've collected all these links, and now we're going to try and explain the Chinese remainder theorem in 5 minutes, because that's how much time we have left. But imagine you've done this over and over again. You've gotten different insecure points on this bad curve. You can, by the way, do this with popular elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman software. It'll allow you to extract secret keys from your target, right? So we set up this condition, this set of little formulas, right? And so we're going to really quickly just try to explain the Chinese remainder theorem for you, right? You don't need to understand CRT from this talk. You just need to know that it's possible for you to implement it. So the backstory for this is you have a Chinese general, there's been a big battle, he's got X amount of soldiers left, their arms are all hacked off, and some of them are standing and some of them are dead, and you want to count them really quickly. So here's a math magic trick here, right? So you want to count this little army of little soldiers that you have here. So instead of actually trying to count these individually, which would take a long time, what you do instead is you say, they're soldiers, you can tell them to do things. So tell them to line up in groups of 5. Don't count the soldiers. Just remember you said 5, and there's one guy left, right? You count the 1. 1 is easy to count. However many that is not easy to count. Now we say line up in groups of 7, right? Again, we know 7 and we just count 1, the remainder after we have them go into groups of 7, right? And then finally we say do it in groups of 11, and we know this time it's 3. 1, 1, 3. And then there's a formula that will go from the groups of 5, groups of 7, groups of 11, and 1, 1, 3, and we can work that back to the original count. It turns out the number is going to be 36. Now, we have all this math on this page here. The real point here is we've unrolled all of the Chinese remainder theorem for you right here, just to give you a sense that this is not complicated math. These numbers just kind of distribute into these formulas. You could implement this even if you were not a programmer in Ruby or Python in a couple of minutes and just test it and get it working. And CRT is very, very valuable for doing number theory at crypto. You'll use it a lot. So that is the Chinese remainder theorem, and we're going to use that to tie together the key formulas. I have no idea if we have enough time to do the demo, but I think the next slide was the demo. You could probably at this point catch us afterwards. Let me see if I can switch over to it. Oh, I do. I totally have the demo. This is going to be like the fastest and least intelligible demo of all time. So Alex implemented this attack in Sage just to show you guys what it looks like. Sage is just Python. That's like a Python version of MATLAB. So what's the first box here?
The first box is just setting up a doubling and adding formulas without using that b parameter from the curve equation.
So when I hit evaluate, what am I seeing?
You're seeing
besides
that.
the pop-up menu.
The next little box sets up the fake toy curve equation, and you can see Alice setting her secret key to 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, I have pre-generated a couple of invalid curve points that I'm just initializing right here. The next box, I'm simulating sending those curve points to Alice.
This is the point at which if you were doing this attack for real, and we got this attack from Watson Ladd, who is a genius cryptographer, grad student at Berkeley, who is inexplicably also our intern this year. This is one of the things that happens when you do crypto challenges, that cryptographers take you seriously, and now one of them, who is much smarter than we are, is now one of our interns. And he implemented this inside of a day in Python, targeting real TLS implementations. We've simulated that here in Sage just so you can kind of see what the math looks like, but there you go.
So those are just showing the responses from Alice. Now we work backwards from her responses to the small little scalar bit of a secret key that we have gotten from her. The next box shows the extended GCD algorithm, which is an important part for CRT, but as you can see, it's a couple lines of code.
When you go to implement the Chinese remainder theorem, which please do go try to implement the Chinese remainder theorem, the one interesting part of implementing it is you have to implement the extended Euclidean algorithm for GCD. The GCD algorithm, the Euclidean GCD algorithm is grade school math. Look at it, it's just not complicated. EGCD is the worst named algorithm in all of mathematics. It's the extended GCD, but it doesn't compute the GCD. It computes something totally different. Just understand this code is very simple, right? You can just look at it, you don't have to understand it. I barely understand it, but I can do this attack, I can make this work, right? So that was him implementing EGCD and getting it to work on that point.
This is basically just like an implementation detail for doing Chinese remainder theorem. Like you actually don't need.
Do I hit evaluate here? I'll hit evaluate here.
And then the final box is actually just doing the CRT with that little function there.
Which gives us the private key from the server. So not as cool as Sean's demo, but it gives you a sense of what it's like. So he's about to hook us off the stage. We had a lot of content in here, so you know, there we go. But like, again, cryptopals.com will have all the exercises online, totally free. We'd love it if you guys took some time, you know, looked at the solutions, sent us pull requests for the other people's solutions, ask us questions. This is stuff we believe in a lot. So look, thank you very much. Also, Sean and Alex both have very, very cool crypto attacks that are even cooler than the stuff that we talked about here. Double byte RC4, a partial nonce disclosure in ECDSA. Both of them will explain that to you if you want to hear why I hate DNSSEC. You can catch me to talk about DNSSEC. Whatever Steve wants to talk to you about. So thank you very, very, very much.